Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Lamb, and as the Associate Dean here in the School of Art at the Cooper Union, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's lecture with Brian Holmes, moderated by Yates McKee, as part of Creative Time's Living as Form series. Before we begin, I just wanted to briefly point out how wonderful it is for the Cooper Union to collaborate with an institution like Creative Time. It's rare to find two institutions with two similar philosophies, even rarer to find two institutions dedicated to alternative radical practice in the arts in New York City. As some of you may know, throughout Cooper's 152-year history, the institution has consistently granted full tuition scholarships to every admitted student, becoming the only private full scholarship college in the US dedicated to the study of art, architecture, and engineering. So students go to free here. Is it socialism? Of course not. Is it philanthropy under the service of education? Yes. And the Cooper Union also historically has been a beacon of social justice and has actively supported numerous influential American discussions and movements, such as the birth of the NAACP and the women's suffrage movement. Thus, Creative Time's mission in promoting a culture of experimentation dedicated to social progress and change not only echoes the Cooper Union's pedagogical mandate, but perhaps this collision, this coinciding of histories allows us to reflect on the nature and limits of what is radical social practice. And of course, this is particularly important given the urgency in negotiating our own cultural moment as we watch and participate in the global waves of social unrest, marked both by promise and precarity, hope and indignity. Given this 30-plus year cycle of bailouts, IMF-backed austerity programs, and more specifically the after effects and collective anguish this causes, I applaud the curatorial staff of the Living as Form series in identifying historical, contemporary, global counter-hegemonic examples of resistance to some of these abstract yet very concrete problems. And with that, I would like to give the mic to Nato Thompson, Chief Curator of Creative Time. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Brian Holmes is in the house. I'm so excited, and thanks to Cooper Union for working with us on this. Is that funny? I don't even know why that's funny. Whatever, I'm crazy. So I'm just going to say, I realized, I was talking to Brian, I was like, oh my God, I don't even have your bio. What are we going to do? And he was like, those things are so boring. Don't even do it. So I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to say in introducing Brian and Yates is just two things. First of all, somebody on our Facebook, I wonder if you're here, said, hey, is that word post-Fordism like something only art historians use? And I thought, oh, I don't know. But that's interesting you think that. In so much as, for me, the term post-Fordism has been extraordinarily useful in thinking about the specific historical moment we are in. And I feel like a repeating record because it seems to me that not a lot of artists get it, but a lot of the institutions that support art don't have their head around it. And that Brian has been at the forefront of articulating how that economic reality impacts actual art on the ground, particularly the way art and activism work together. And so I'm really excited to have him. And he's also one of these people that when someone says, is post-Fordism something only art historians say? He's one of those people that will explain it to you in terms that are friendly and understandable. You know, nice, like nice people. They're still super brilliant and like theory. And then Yates McKee is here too, who is another phenomenal inspiration and friend who is writing a lot these days on ecological activism and art. So I'm glad that he's going to be here at the end to do some moderation. And finally, of course, this is a part of a show called Living as Form that opens September 23rd with the Creative Time Summit. We're going to be releasing tickets for that soon. It's going to be at the Skirball Center at NYU. Get your tickets because it sells out so fast. Everyone will just complain on our Facebook they didn't get tickets. I'm telling you, get them. We're going to have 38 activist artists from around the world presenting, and it'll kick off a major experimental project surveying socially engaged art from the last 20 years from around the world in various disciplines. Without further ado, Brian Holmes.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I got to say, I like the NATO style of presentation. It's kind of a relief. Glad to be here. It's been a while since I've been in New York. When I was asked to do something on this subject, I was glad because I've never been asked to do something on this subject of post-Fordism and art. We in Paris, in the Multitudes Journal, kind of lived with this because the people who really started that, you know, were Tony Negri and Maurizio Lazzarato and Paolo Virno, and all these people had lived through the change from the way that society was articulated after the Second World War, and really the factory system in almost every detail of life, to the kind of society that we have now, which has really transformed on so many levels that it becomes a bit hard to even imagine what is meant. Okay, the post we can get, but the actual Fordism becomes a little harder to get, I think. And this is something that fascinates me, because I think that despite that distance, I think many of the structures of industrial society have never gone away. They have remained living in a kind of afterlife, and almost a zombie afterlife. Even one of the sociologists who interests me the most is Ulrich Beck, and he says that society is dominated by what he calls zombie categories. That is to say, we haven't, even after 40 years, much of society has either failed to or deliberately refused to come to terms with the increase in autonomy of individuals, the increase in the complexity of people's lives, the complexity of not only their mental life, but also their affective life, and the difficulty of articulating politics in a situation where all the problems of modernism, modernization, and therefore Fordism, and I would use those three words in this talk almost interchangeably, modernism, modernization, above all, the process of making the world modern, and the way that was articulated first by Henry Ford and then by the Keynesian Fordism of the post-war period. All those things actually are what created the rise of the United States to its hegemonic position in the world. And it's still many of the things that we have to work with and against today. So today I'm going to start way back at the moment of the change to post-Fordism, and I'm going to try to move through, perhaps in a somewhat abstract way, but I'll continually be showing pictures and making references to lived experiences, to works, and to political situations, so that I hope that the abstraction will meet with a certain amount of concrete experience as well. A long time ago, I translated a book by Raul Ruiz, and he said that for him, cinema is a machine for traveling in space and time. Well, I hope that this talk could be somehow related to Raul Ruiz's way of doing cinema. The title for this trip tonight is Eventwork, the Fourfold Matrix of Contemporary Social Movements. So, art into life. Is there any more persistent utopia in the history of vanguard expressions? Shedding its external forms, its inherited techniques, its specialized materials, art becomes a living gesture, rippling out across the sensible surface of humanity. It creates an ethos, a mythos, an intensely vibrant presence. It migrates from the pencil, the chisel, or the brush into ways of doing and modes of being. From the German Romantics to the beatnik poets, from the Dadaists to the living theater, this story has been told again and again, each time with a startling new twist on the same basic phrase. At stake is much more than the search for stylistic renewal. It's about transforming your everyday existence. Theory into revolution. The fundamental demand of the thinkers and rioters of May '68 was also changer la vie, change life. But the consequences of intimate desire were now supposed to be economic and structural. Situationist theory had no meaning if it could not become workers' democracy, immediate communization. Marx, Mao, Marcuse was a slogan to be shouted in the streets. The self-overcoming of art was understood as just one part of a far-reaching program to vanquish class divides and to put alienated individuals back in touch with each other. Now the 60s, which I'm talking about now, were full of really wild fantasies and unrealized dreams. Yet there were significant experiments which were undertaken in all walks of life with consequences that continue up to the present. Campus radicalism gave new life to educational alternatives. The countercultural use of handheld video cameras led on to the kind of radical media projects that we know today. And politics itself went through a metamorphosis. Autonomous Marxism gave rise to self-organized projects all across Europe, while affinity groups based on Quaker conceptions of direct democracy took deep root in the USA and then came back at full anarchist force in Seattle around the turn of the century. From the AIDS movements onwards, basically, activism regained urgency and seriousness, grappling with concrete and progressively more complex issues such as globalization and climate change. The question that this continuous development raises is not how to aestheticize living as form. It's how to change the forms in which we are living. Now, activism is what I'm going to talk about today. This was the question, post-Fordist activism. I would say that today, activism always includes at least 4 dimensions. Investigative research is fundamental to social movements, which are always at grips with complex legal, scientific, and economic problems. Participatory art is basic to any group taking its issues to the streets, because it stresses a commitment to both representation and lived experience. Networked communications and strategies of mass media penetration form yet another characteristic of contemporary activism, whose directly embodied struggles would disappear without a megaphone. Finally, activist politics consists in the collaborative coordination of this whole set of practices. The fourfold matrix replaces any single easily definable initiative. No doubt the complexity of this fourfold process explains the rarity of effective interventionism. But that's really the challenge of political engagement. What has to be grasped if we want to renew our democratic culture is the convergence of art, theory, media, and politics into a mobile force that oversteps the limit of any professional sphere or disciplinary field, while still drawing on their knowledge and their technical capacities. This essay tries to develop a concept for the fourfold matrix of contemporary social movements. The name I propose for it is Eventwork. But wait, if we're talking grassroots activism, why even talk about complexity? The reason is that the grassroots has gone urban, and it's us, the middle-class subjects of contemporary capitalist societies, which are based on knowledge, technology, and communication. Our disciplines create these societies. The point is to explore how we can act and what role art, theory, media, and politics can have in our own forms of intervention. Like the sociologist Ulrich Beck in his book on the Risk Society, I think the movement outside the modernist institutions has been made necessary by the failure of these institutions to respond to the dangers created by modernization itself. These dangers grew clearer at the end of the post-war period, when the Keynesian Fordist mode of development revealed its inherent links with inequality, war, ecological destruction, and the repression of minorities. It became apparent that not only so-called hard science, but also the social sciences and the humanities were helping to produce these problems. Yet nothing in their eternal criteria of truth or legitimacy could restrain them in any way. The most conscious and articulate exponents of each of the separated disciplines then felt the need to develop a critique of their own field and to merge that critique into an attempt at social transformation. Only in this way could they find an imminent response to the sources of their own alienation. So in other words, to find how to make that move art into life in your own discipline doesn't mean just abandoning your discipline. It means working through it from the inside. And that's what I'm going to be getting at in this whole paper. So there's a paradox of event work. It starts from within the disciplines whose limits it seeks to overcome. In this text, I'll start with the internal contradictions of avant-garde art in the late 60s and with the attempt by one group of artists to go beyond them. With that model in the background, I'll sketch out the emergence of an expanded realm of activism in the post-Fordist era, from the 70s up to now. The point is to discover some basic ideas that could change the way each of us conceives the relations between our daily life, our politics, and our discipline or profession. In this movement, certain truisms will be exposed to their shortfalls. What I want to make clear is that despite their rhetorical attractions, the twin formulas of art into life and theory into revolution can't describe the actual pathways that lead people beyond their professional and institutional limits. The failure to describe those paths with the right mix of urgency and complexity leads to either the sort of weakness of relational art, intimacy on display in a sterile white cube, or to the radical chic of critical theory, which is basically revolution for sale in an academic bookstore. Through their weakness and emptiness, these failures of cultural critique lead to reactionary calls for a return to the modernist disciplines. The result is a disjunct from the present and a lingering state of collective paralysis, which is the most striking characteristic of left politics today, especially in the United States. As living conditions really deteriorate in the capitalist democracies, one pressing question is how artists, intellectuals, media makers, and political organizers can come together to change something in the course of collective existence. Part of the answer lies in a move across institutional boundaries and modernist norms. Each of the separated disciplines needs to define the paradox of event work and thereby open up a place for itself, beyond itself, in the fourfold matrix of contemporary social movements. Now, time's short, so I want to go straight to what I think is the most impressive example of event work in the late 1960s, which you find not in New York, London, or Paris, but in Argentina. The late 60s was the moment of that country's industrial takeoff, and a really rapidly expanding middle class enjoyed very close links to the developed metropolitan centers, particularly where culture was concerned. In capitalist societies, utopian longings often accompany periods of economic growth because all that material and symbolic production promises that there might be real use values. You might actually be able to enjoy this stuff. But since mid-1966, and this is really the paradox, the absolute contradiction of capitalism, since mid-1966, Argentina was in the grip of a military dictatorship, which repressed individual freedoms and imposed brutal programs of economic rationalization. Under these conditions, a circle of self-consciously vanguard artists in Buenos Aires and Rosario began to sense the futility of the rapid cycles of formal innovation that had marked the decade of pop-op happenings, minimalism, performance, and conceptualism. They became keenly aware that inventions designed to shatter bourgeois norms were being used as signs of prestige and intellectual superiority by the elites, to the point where, as Leon Ferrari wrote, the culture created by the artist becomes his enemy. Therefore, these artists began an increasingly violent break with the gallery and museum circuits that had formerly sustained their practices, using transgressive works actions and declarations to curtail their own participation in the officially sanctioned shows, and notably in the famous Ditella Institute of Buenos Aires. They were really violently opposed, and far more than satirical. They interrupted, they broke up exhibitions, they cut off their own participation in the high art of their time. By midsummer of 1968, they decided to organize an independent congress, the first national meeting on avant-garde art. The goal was to define their autonomy from the elite cultural system, to formulate their social ideal, which was basically a Guevarist revolution, and to plan the realization of a work that would embody their aims. In this work, the aesthetic material, as Ferrari explained, would no longer be articulated according to purely formal innovations, but instead according to immediately graspable meanings, as he said, which in their turn would be subjective to transgressive processes in order to generate a powerful denunciation of existing social conditions. Echoing Ferrari's approach in the language of semiotics and information theory, another contributor to the meeting, Nicolas Rosa, insisted that, and I quote, "The work is experimental when it proceeds to the rupture of the cultural model." This rupture was to be frank, direct, and irreversible, enacted in a visual, verbal, and gestural language that would allow anyone to participate. It would also be disseminated in the mass media. Situated outside the elite institutions and linked to the social context of its realization, the work would, and I quote, "produce an effect similar to that of political action," in the words of the artist Juan Pablo Renzi, who had drafted the framing text for the meeting. And because ideological statements are easily absorbed, according to Renzi, the revolutionary work must transform the ideology into a real event from within its own structure. End of quote. This was the theoretical program that led to Tucumán Arde, or Tucumán is Burning. So what was meant by this title? The group of artists sought to denounce the process of restructuring that had been imposed on the sugar industry in the province of Tucumán, resulting in widespread unemployment and hunger for the workers. Beyond Tucumán itself, they wanted to reveal the larger program of economic rationalization being carried out by the national bourgeoisie under dictatorial command. To do so would require the production of what they called counter-information on the strictly semiotic level, using factual analysis to oppose the government propaganda campaign. So the artists collaborated with students, professors, filmmakers, photographers, journalists, and also a left-wing union, engaging in a covert fact-finding mission which they disguised as a traditional cultural project. In the course of 2 trips, they visited fields and factories, circulated questionnaires, interviewed, filmed, and photographed workers and their families, and sought to verify the preliminary analyses that they had conducted off-site. This research was the first phase of the project, culminating in a press conference where they ripped the veil from their activities and explained the real purpose of their work, hoping, in vain as it turned out, to raise a scandal and push their messages out into the mass media. Now, when I first heard about that, I thought, this is amazing, because this is what we are doing now. You know, I was very involved in the counter-globalization movements, as I'll talk about later. This is the kind of investigative work that we're doing now. And I was also, all the more surprised as I realized that they conceived that it was not only about investigation, but it was also about creating what they called an over-informational environment, or circuit rather, un circuito sobre-informacional, which was supposed to unfold on the perceptual level in a manifestation which would no longer be an art show, but which would be kind of a political rhetoric of information that was meant to be transformative of the public. And for that, again, they called upon all the disciplines. So they mounted a kind of teaser campaign before the show, sort of disseminating the words Tucumán and Tucumán Arde throughout the urban environment. They then created 2 multimedia exhibitions, not in art museums, but in union halls in Rosario and Buenos Aires, attempting in both cases to use not just a single room, but the entire building. They deployed press clippings and images from the government propaganda campaign, and they contrasted them to economic and public health statistics, as well as diagrams indicating the links between industrial interests, local and national officials, and foreign capital. They displayed documentary photographs, projected films, delivered speeches, and circulated a critical study prepared by the collaborating sociologists. At roughly half-hour intervals, the lights were cut, dramatizing the kinds of infrastructural failures that were typically endured by the people in the provinces. Bitter coffee was served to give the public a taste of the hunger affecting a sugarcane growing region where food and sugar itself were in chronically short supply. This exhibition strategy was, by all accounts, a huge success. The opening in Rosario on November the 3rd attracted over 1,000 people on the first night, and Rosario, you know, is a provincial town, it's not the capital, resulting in a prolongation of the show for 2 weeks instead of 1. It was then restaged in Buenos Aires on November 25th of 1968, this time including the covertly produced third cinema film, La Hora de los Hornos, The Hour of the Furnaces, by Octavio Getino and Fernando Solanas, whose projection was halted every half hour for immediate discussion. And that's that film of which, that incredibly violent and provocative film of which I showed just one short clip. The level of courage implied by this process under conditions of military rule is difficult to imagine. The show in Buenos Aires was censored on its second day by threats against the Union, exposing the repressive character of the regime and inviting a further radicalization of the country's cultural producers. Because of its collective organization, its experimental nature, its investigatory process, its tight articulation of analytic and aesthetic means, its oppositional stance, and finally its untimely closure, Tucumán Arte has become something of a myth in Argentina and abroad. The American critic Lucy Lepard, who would shortly thereafter be active in the Art Workers Coalition here in New York City, repeatedly claimed that she had been radicalized by her meeting with members of the group on a short visit to Argentina in October 1968. The French journal Robo, which is a kind of amazing avant-garde journal of the time, devoted a dossier to the work in 1971, emphasizing its break with bourgeois art and its revolutionary potentials. In its more recent reception, which has included really a large number of shows and articles from the late 1990s on, or in other words, a reception which corresponds exactly to the rise of activism in the Western world, this work, Tucumán Arte, has been linked to either global, so-called global or Latin American conceptualism, and also to a particularly interventionist form of media art. Now, all this attention from the museum world testifies to an intense public interest in a process that emphasized common speech, direct action, and a break with bourgeois cultural forms. But of course, that same attention opens up the questions of absorption, banalization, and neutralization. In the most thoroughly researched analysis, the Argentine art historian Ana Longoni vindicates the aims of the project by asking the obvious disciplinary question: where's the vanguard art in Tucumán Arte? It's kind of the version of what passes in America for, yes, but is it art, right? So where is it really? And she answers, and I quote, "If Tucumán Arte can be confused with a political act, it's because it was a political act. The artist had realized a work that extended the limits of art to zones that did not correspond to it, that were external." So what can be achieved by this move to zones that are external to art? At a time when institutional channels were blocked and the modernizing process had become a dictatorial nightmare, the project was able to elicit and orchestrate the efforts of a broad division of cultural labor, capable of analyzing complex social phenomena. Through multiple expressive practices, it then disseminated the results of this investigative labor in order to produce awareness and contribute to active resistance. What results is a change in the finality, or in fact in the use value, of cultural production. As one statement indicates, the project was conceived, and I quote, to help make possible the creation of an alternative culture that can form part of the revolutionary process. Or, as the dossier in Robo put it, and I quote again, the extra imagination found in Tucumán Arde, if compared, for example, to the usual agitation campaign, comes expressly from a practice of and a preliminary reflection on the notions of event, participation, and proliferation of the aesthetic experience. And that's basically the definition of what I would call event work. So the effectiveness of event work comes from a perceptual, analytic, and expressive collaboration which lends an affective charge to the interpretation of a real-world situation. In this way, the project was capable of touching people, of involving them, not through a retreat to the exalted dreamland of a white cube, but instead within the everyday complexity of life in a technocratic society, where the most elusive possibility is that of shared resistance to the vast, encroaching programs of government and industry. The question is how to extend that kind of resistance into the present, and how to make it last past the event itself. Graciela Carnevale, who is a friend of mine and one of the participants in the project, said this, and I quote her, "There is always a great difficulty in how to transmit this experience or make it perceptible beyond the information about it." Her dilemma is that of everyone who has been involved in a powerful social movement. And she asked in the same breath, she asked, how to share an experience that produced such great transformations in oneself. I mean, we have the documents of this experience. But let's try to think, because I've just been describing a change on the very cusp of this change from the Fordist society, the disciplined, regimented, industrially modernist society of Fordism, to the more complex society of today. And in a way, what's so interesting about Tucumán Arde is that for almost the first time you see in action in a full-blown way, the possibility of coming to grips, not just with society and how it works, but with the process of trying to communicate a critique. And in that process, people were transformed. Graciela, in particular, feels that she was completely transformed. So her question is, how could you possibly share that experience? And I would ask, what does it mean to share an experience? Can one share that experience, or maybe is it necessary to share something else? So we should move to the present. The four vectors of event work converge into action beneath the pressure of injustice and the anguishing awareness of risk in situations where your own discipline, profession, or institutional world proves incapable of responding and some other course of action must be taken. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to do it, as friends of mine in the collective Ne Pas Plier used to say. The thing is, you find out when you do it. Activism is the making common of a desire and a will to change the world, and to do so in situations of uncertainty where you really have to risk what you can on a venture whose outcome you really can't know. When this desire and resolve can be shared, the intensive assemblage, or the sort of affective machine of a social movement, brings both the antagonistic and the utopian dimension into daily experience, into leisure hours, passionate relations, the home, the bed, your dreams. It brings public responsibility into private passion. That's living as political form. Of course, it's not supposed to be that way in modern society, where an institution exists, in theory at least, to address every need or problem. Experts manage risks on government time. Artists provide highly sublimated forms of entertainment. The media respond faithfully to popular demands for information. And social movements are really just the disciplined actions of organized laborers seeking higher wages, all beneath the watchful eye of professional politicians. That's the modernist theory. This functional division of industrial society reached its peak of democratic legitimacy in the decades after World War II, when the Keynesian Fordist welfare state claimed to achieve stable growth, income equality, and social benefits for an expanding middle class, which included unionized factory laborers alongside an increasingly broad range of university-trained technicians, service providers, and managers. What revealed itself, though, in 1968 and afterwards, was not just the inability of the industrial state to go on delivering the goods for that expanding middle class. I mean, this was true, right? There was an economic crisis beginning in 68 that lasted throughout the 70s. The average sort of theory says the state could no longer provide the goods, so there was unrest. But there's something more to it than that. What revealed itself with particular intensity inside the educational and cultural circuits made possible by economic growth was a shared awareness that the theory doesn't work, and that despite its supposedly corrective institutions, capitalist modernization itself produces conditions of gendered and racialized exploitation, neo-colonial expropriation, mental and emotional manipulation, and ever-worsening environmental pollution. The sense of a threat lodged within the utopian promises of Keynesian social democracy and Fordist industrial modernization was a major motive for the emergence of the so-called new social movements, which couldn't be reduced to workplace bargaining demands and which couldn't adequately be conceived within the frameworks of traditional Marxist class analysis. In these new social movements, to the dismay of an older and more doctrinaire political generation, issues of alienation and therefore of identity began coming ineluctably to the fore. The people involved, first in the anti-war campaigns and then in a far wider range of struggles, had to bring new causes, new sites and strategies of action into some kind of alignment with very thorny questions of perception, knowledge, communication, motivation, identity, trust, and even self-analysis, all of which became more acute as immediate material necessity receded into the background of the consumer societies. Artistic expression now appeared as a necessarily ambiguous mediator between personal conviction and public representation. The intersections of theory and daily life became more dense and entangled, with the result that each movement, or even each campaign, turned into something original and surprising, and something that would be the momentary public crystallization of a singular group process. The simultaneous inadequacy and necessity of this way of doing politics has come to define the entire period of post-Fordism. It is our actuality, our present tense, at least from a left perspective. If an intervention like Tucumán Arde can still appear familiar in its modes of organization and operation, if not in its ideologies and revolutionary horizons, it's because the basic sets of objective and subjective problems underlying it are still very much with us today. All of this might come into focus if we think back to one of the most influential direct action movements in the post-Fordist period, which is AIDS activism. Now, I wasn't part of this movement, so I can't really speak to its intensities. But what's so impressive, and to me it is very impressive, I wasn't in the United States for most of this time, so it's It's only recently that I've come to know more about these movements, about not just the art that they produced, but also all the different forms of conflict that they set off and the basis on which they launched these conflicts. I think it's really fascinating. What's impressive from a distance is the collective reaction to a situation of extreme risk, where what's at issue is not the absolute capacity, but instead the willingness of a democratic society to respond scientifically, medically, and economically to threats that weigh on certain stigmatized minorities. In this situation, the questions of who you are, who the others think you are, what rights you are accorded, and what rights you are ready to demand all become life or death issues, which are felt and expressed as much as they are formulated and staged. A recent book by Deborah Gould called Moving Politics makes it clear how much these affective dimensions mattered after a threshold of indignation had been crossed and grief was transformed into anger. The event can be a glance or a tear in private, a gesture or a speech in a meeting, as much as a public action or a media intervention. All of these are ways to create, sustain, and modulate affects, which mobilize activist groups and also exert a very powerful force on other people. At the same time, one should never forget that the rights at stake in this struggle were not just so-called natural rights, such as freedom of speech or the right to own property. Instead, they were, and still are, the social rights to fund or instigate certain lines of research, to legalize or ingest certain kinds of medications, to receive or dispense certain kinds of publicly funded care. In an emergency situation, it became apparent that these rights were dependent not only on scientific and legal arguments, but also on the way that risk groups were represented in the media, and on the way that politicians monitored, solicited, or encouraged those representations so as to advance their own policies or ensure their own re-election. To intervene, therefore, required both technical and cultural analysis. And that's what's so characteristic of a post-Fordist social movement. Because at the same time as every issue is technical, ineluctably technical, unavoidably technical, at the same time every issue is rhetorical and affective because it's political. And it has to move through the mass of conflicting opinions that is a post-Fordist society where increasingly there is no way to command people. There's only the possibility of channeling what it is that people do. So the post-Fordist society presents a very different problem for politics than the Fordist society did, where was the idea that through the media you could basically get people to do what you want. To intervene in this kind of society required the coordination of a complex division of labor under more or less anarchic conditions where there could be no director, no hierarchy, no flow chart, etc. On this, I'd like to quote the art critic and activist Douglas Crimp in an interview with someone called Tina Takemoto. Crimp says, "Within ACT UP, there was a sophistication about the uses of representation for activist politics. This awareness came not only from people who knew art theory, but also from people who had worked in public relations, design, and advertising. So ACT UP was a weird hybrid of traditional leftist politics, innovative postmodern theory, and access to professional resources. One of the most emblematic images associated with ACT UP was the Silence Equals Death logo, composed of a simple pink triangle on a black background with white sans serif type. This image was created by a group of gay designers who organized the Silence Equals Death project before ACT UP even started. Although they didn't design the logo for ACT UP, they lent it to the movement, and it was used on t-shirts as an official emblem." So here again, what lends resonance to the event is the difference of the people involved, and therefore of the techniques and knowledges they are able to bring to bear whenever they find the inspiration or the need or the courage to overstep their disciplinary boundaries and start to work at odds with the dominant functions. That all of this should only become possible under the menace of illness and the direct threat of death is, I think, of the essence. It's not something one should avoid or shirk away from. Activism of whatever sort arises and spreads in the face of existential threats. What's at issue then in our blinkered and controlled and self-satisfied societies is the perception of a threat and the modulation of affect in the face of that threat. Or in other words, the way you rupture a cultural pattern, the way you motivate yourself and others to undertake a course of action. That rejoins the larger transgeneral question of event work, exactly as Graciela Carnevale expressed it. How to share an experience that produced such great transformations in oneself. Now, from my own experience, I've participated in a very large movement, or really a constellation of social movements, the ones opposing financially driven globalization. These movements started somewhere around 1994, and they arose across the earth, in Mexico, India, France, Britain, the USA, etc. From the beginning, they interacted a lot, first through anarchist networks and what we called counter summits at the time, then through the World Social Forums. The people I worked with, mostly in Europe but also in the Americas, were able to twist or subvert some of the utopian energies of the internet boom, combining them with grassroots and indigenous demands to create an embodied, dialogical, antagonistic, and ecological vision. In the course of these movements, the relations between critical and philosophical writing, artistic process, direct action, and tactical media opened up a new field of practice, far more vital than anything I had previously known. This convinced me that contemporary art in its most challenging and experimental forms has indeed been suffering from the cultural confinement that Robert Smithson long ago diagnosed, and that its real possibilities unfold on more engaging terrains whose access has mostly been foreclosed by the institutional frameworks of museums, galleries, magazines, university departments, etc. The concept of event work is based directly on the experiences of those terrains, which generated important cooperative and communicational capacities and helped revitalize left political culture. It's obvious, though, that despite all that, and that there was really a lot going on. I mean, what I'm trying to show you is just kind of the way that ideas and work with philosophy, work with critique in the human sciences, kind of kept bouncing off and threading through different sorts of activist practices at different class levels, you know? And this was something that really revitalized the left. We can see that today in the United States today, I think, the distant echoes of that, particularly since the World Social Forums have actually been held in the U.S. version, the U.S. Social Forums, something really great where one could actually feel this kind of intergenerational, you know, sort of transformation of activism to absorb what had been kept at the gates during the Bush years. Because really, in so many ways, you know, Seattle happened here, and then it was foreclosed. In this case, it was foreclosed with all the might of a military power capable of mobilizing not just the money, not just the industry, not just the bodies, but above all, the affects of a huge society, which is our own. And so in many ways, we did not feel the kinds of transformations that started to occur in the world when post-Fordism really became hegemonic. That is to say, when the internet expanded across the earth and when globalization really meant that not only that there were not borders between the different activities, but that everyone was exposed in a way to the possibilities and also the anguish of everyone else. You know, because this is the condition in the world today. This is the condition that's really affecting us, that's affecting Europe, that's affecting the countries who look to North America and Western Europe as both a place that they would of possibility and also as the source of oppression. You know, What's happened is that as globalization becomes not just extensive but intensive, we all live with that vast relation of planetary society. It's under our skins, you know? And I think that there's something fascinating in the chance to inherit different experiments, different experiences, different attempts to deal with what a situation that could be perceived on the horizon by people in the past, but that we now live 100%, you know, that we live completely. And this is something fascinating. At the same time, it's obvious that the alter-globalization movements, as we came to call them, were not able to overturn the ruling consensus on capitalist development and economic growth. In fact, the recent financial crisis has both vindicated the arguments we began making as much as 15 years ago, and also shown those arguments to be politically powerless, incapable of contributing to any concrete change. On the macro level, I mean, on the level the way that where national and transnational politics is run. The same verdict was delivered to environmental activists by the debacle of the Copenhagen Climate Summit. All of that fits into a larger pattern. If I had to offer a one-sentence version of what I've learned about society since 1994, it might go like this. The entire edifice of speculative, computer-managed, gentrifying, militarized, overpolluted, just-in-time, debt-driven neoliberal globalization has taken form since the early 80s as a way to block the institutional changes that were set into motion by the social movements of the 60s and 70s. In other words, cultural confinement does not just affect experimental art, as Smithson seems to have believed. Instead, it applies to all egalitarian, emancipatory, and ecological aspirations in the post-Fordist period, which now reveals itself to be a period of pure crisis management, one that has not produced any fundamental solutions to the problems of industrial modernization, but has only exported them across the earth. Yet these problems are serious, and they have accumulated on every level. What's the use of aesthetics if you don't have eyes to see? It would not even be a metaphor to say that the United States, in particular, has been living on credit since the outset of the post-Fordist era. And now, slowly but inexorably, the bill is coming due. So the question I've tried to raise is this: how do cultural practices become political acts? Or to put it more sharply, I'm almost finished here, because this is just in time, you know. So, to put it more sharply, how does the operative force of a cultural activity, or indeed of a discipline, somehow break through the normative and legal limits imposed by a profession? That question can be framed in a kind of reversing mirror by an image from the wave of protest that swept over the state of Wisconsin in the face of Governor Walker's ultimately successful bid to impose an austerity plan which includes an end to the right of collective bargaining. The image is just a protest snap from someone's digital camera found on the web. It shows a middle-class white woman standing in front of an American flag next to some kind of Beaux-Arts statue. She holds a sign in her hands that says in bold capital letters, "I am not replaceable, I am professional." Who is this woman? An artist? A curator? An art historian? A cultural critic? Why does she proclaim her sense of security and insecurity in this way? Does she still have a job? Does she still have rights? And how about ourselves? Where do our rights come from? How are they maintained? How are they produced? It seems to me that in the United States right now, as in other countries, I'm thinking of the Netherlands just today, there is a rising feeling of existential threat. You meet it wherever you turn. The next place I will go are the hydrofracking gas lands of Pennsylvania. Yet increasingly, it appears that laws, ethical codes, and the requirements of professionalism in all-absorbing, highly competitive careers make it impossible to find the time, the place, the medium, or the format in which to resist. This reminds us of what Thoreau taught in his time, namely that being a citizen of a democratic country means always being on the edge of starting a revolution. Something about our forms of living and of working has to change, not just aesthetically and not just in theory, but pragmatically in terms of the kinds of activity and the modes of organization. Or as Doug Ashford once put it, civil disobedience is an art history too. I realize these kinds of declarations make everyone rightly uncomfortable for various reasons. But as the temporary illusion called middle-class status begins to crumble and professionals become eminently replaceable, the comfort zone also narrows. Choosing how to overstep it, perhaps through the practices I've described as event work, or perhaps in other ways, could be more passionately engaging and more productive of rights than just allowing yourself to be simply pushed outside the pale. So thank you for your patience.
Okay, so we're going to have Yates come up and talk with Brian. Are we going to have chairs, Kevin, or something like that? I don't know. I think we're going to bring out some chairs or something. Oh, well, you guys got the Charlie Rose chairs. Hey, this is very professional. Thus replaceable.
That's replaceable, yeah. Why don't we just kind of get rid of this?
Here you go, Yates.
Thanks. Okay, I'm just gonna, I have brief preliminary sort of remarks about what I think are some of the key salient points, and then I'm gonna do a quick wish list of topics that I want to arrive to. Yes, okay. Okay, so Holmes' talk was admirably site-specific, I think, to the present institutional context of the Creative Time Living as Form event, situated as the latter is in a high-profile urban art and architecture school at the edge of a classic but ongoing locus of gentrification led by the so-called creative class. Indeed, the paper addresses itself to an us or a we defined in terms of, quote, middle-class subjects of contemporary capitalist societies, specifically involved with the professional and institutional domains of art in particular and the production of culture and knowledge more generally. Holmes calls for this we to rethink our relation to those domains, the relation of those domains to one another, and ultimately how these modes of expertise might be articulated with other practices in an expanded field of socio-political life. And life is a word I want to come back to in my wish list of questions. So beginning with the Russian constructivist injunction, art into life, Holmes begins by quite overtly noting that this is a perennial question of the artistic avant-garde, asked over and over during the past century. But he makes a convincing case, I think, that the very persistence, recurrence, and repetition of the question in different historical contexts itself has always given rise to new and unpredictable twists, as he calls it. Thus, it's not a matter of merely reinventing the proverbial avant-garde wheel, but rather of attaching that wheel to new machinic assemblages and taking them for test drives into unknown territories of what Holmes has elsewhere called extradisciplinary research and activism. So Holmes calls for us to overcome, to challenge, to exceed the limits, boundaries, and norms that his concept of event work conjures up, or calls for. And he places this in a dissident counter-tradition, historically encompassing the Situationists, Tucumán Arde, ACT UP, and also a little shout-out to Group Material and Doug Ashford there in the end. And also the cornucopia of politicized cultural practices that have emerged over the past decade surrounding the counter-globalization movement. I think Brian has really been among the top theorists of the cultural and aesthetic dimensions and political dimensions of those movements. Okay, so this is a concisely periodized intergenerational history that I know that the Creative Time Living as Form project is ultimately going to aim to account for in the final project in an archival manner. And this question of how such projects are both remembered and sustained, I think, is a really important question that you mentioned with regard to Argentina. Okay, so this expansive counter-tradition provides the inspiration for Holmes's fourfold matrix of contemporary social movements, which encompasses, quote, investigative research, participatory art, networked communication, and strategies of mass media penetration, and collaborative coordination of a diverse set of practices. The latter involve, quote, widely shared affects and the lived experience of resistance. Okay, so here are the questions that I'd like to pose. I'll list them now, and then I'll ask them in a more elaborate way to Brian. First, I'm interested in the relation between the event work and the artwork. I'm interested in the category of affect, and also what Brian has elsewhere called affectivism. In a kind of sociological way, I'm interested in the relation of his discourse of event work to the contemporary cultures of the mainstream progressive left liberal sphere in the United States. I'm interested in the possibility of reinventing the profession of art criticism. And at the very end, and we'll get to this issue, is the relation between the question of art and life and how that might be rethought in terms of the category of biopolitics, and how then, in turn, we could articulate that with questions of ecology and regionalism, because I know that you're about to travel to the gaslands, as it were. Okay, so number one, so I don't know if we're going to get to all of that, but number one, this question which on the one hand is kind of tedious and predictable, but we were all talking a little while ago, that it almost inevitably comes up, so let's sort of get it out of the way, and I think in the same way that the art-life problem remains interesting to reinvent and re-explore in new contexts, what becomes of the category of the artwork in this expanded sense of kind of counter-information, counter-exhibition, in which the kind of disciplinary specificity of art, I mean, on the one hand, you describe it as being decentered or deprivileged, and it becomes one term among others. But I wonder if there's also a risk of it like utterly dissolving altogether, right? And that it merely becomes, as you put it at one point, a kind of disguise or an excuse for doing something else that's not really art, right?
Well, it's certainly a matter of, does that work or does it necessary? Maybe does it work? Okay. It's certainly, what was I going to say? It's certainly a matter of doing something else, but it's not just a matter of disguising what you're doing. And it seems to me that what actually happens is that art gets reduced a lot in contemporary society because there's something really interesting about the demand of certain kinds of artists at certain moments. A demand to find out what it is that what they are doing could really do if it wasn't confined. I mean, that's the basic formula of what's called avant-garde, I think we can redo that in a different way today. It no longer has to be avant-garde because we live in complex societies where the avant-garde can potentially be everywhere at every class level and it doesn't, it isn't confined to New York City and so on. But that kind of demand really interests me. I think that, of course, I think that, since I think that the modernist institutions have been stuck and have stayed modernist as we have moved into a much more problematic, open but problematic situation, I think, therefore, that this part of being stuck is this stuck on, this perennial complaint, I mean, what you have going on is a kind of continuum of challenges and responses to those challenges, and in that continuum there are also artists, just as there are, fantastic scientists, just as there are philosophers, just as there are media makers, but unfortunately only a few, because this is not encouraged by the institutions that we still have. And to get it to be encouraged is the whole point of what I'm talking about. I actually don't think you can do that without a struggle. It's a struggle with oneself. It's a struggle with one's environment. It's a struggle with the need to make a living. It's a struggle with what, other specialists call the symbolic. Because, there I'm talking about hierarchy, authority, the kind of image that you make of yourself out of someone else's gaze, And those struggles, I think, are fascinating, and of course I think they make bizarre and monstrous, efflorescences, which is exactly what I want out of art. So I don't have the problem because I'm not into this sort of vague sort of thing that just becomes life. I'm more interested in pushing a whole number of contradictions that become far more interesting than the kind of ossified definitions of practices that we have.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like the issue of proliferating different kinds of institutional formats that are not reducible either to academy or museum is really key. Although I think the example of group material and of ACT UP, right, of being able to operate tactically in a lot of different platforms, right? But the art world has certain resources, certain platforms that can be, activated, but it's not reducible to that. And again, I think in terms of your overall trajectory, that's been another really impressive facet of your work, is engaging with a lot of different types of audiences, a lot of different types of platforms, including things like the World Social Forum, the US Social Forum, and so on. In terms of now I know you wouldn't say that art has a privileged purchase on the realm of the affective. You do seem to hint in your writing and in a couple of moments in the talk that art nevertheless can have certain, again, I don't want to say privilege, but certain kinds of special engagements or techniques of modulating affect in the way that you put it. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about affect and this notion of affectivism. And I think the kind of intergenerational reference to ACT UP and to Crimp is really key in that when he was talking about the threshold of indignation was crossed, grief was transformed into anger. I mean, one certainly thinks of the affective dimensions of public space that have recently emerged around Indignados in Spain, around Tahrir Square, or also moments of joy like we saw yesterday in Ohio when the We Are Ohio campaign successfully delivered 1 million signatures to have the anti-union bill, what's the word? Repealed, or to force a referendum on that. So anyway, to the question of affect, how art, because again, it's not specific to art, but that seems to be one of the things that attracts you to art, continues to attract you to the realm of art, is that dimension. Yeah.
I think it's rather, I'm attracted to that. I mean, maybe I like hot art, maybe I like hot other things too, and not just hot, but affective, things. That is to say, I'm not that crazy. I mean, you can do a lot of things at once. You can be a theorist. I'm a theorist, right? I mean, theory is supposed to be cool, right? So I try to do hot theory. Why is that? So I'm not sure that the affect moves. It's not. I don't think that art is specifically affective. But what do you do with the aesthetic? It's not. I mean, you can look at the aesthetic. Okay, it's a concept, Baumgarten, all that. There's a concept of the aesthetic. Fine, that's a philosopher's business. But what the concept is pointing to is that which isn't, ratiocination. It's not. It's supposed to be the other of reason. Okay, some of the most interesting philosophy has tried to follow how reason gets entangled with its other to the point where the only difference between the two is the very vitalism of people trying to expand who they can be. I think that's what, that's the kind of thing that interests me. And I think that in art there's a chance to develop that, and not coincidentally there's a chance to develop that with the mind, We live in a very affective society. The media, the mass media society is all about affects. So where would be the experimental realm where you could work with affects? That's what I'm interested in art.
Okay, here is the more sort of here's the more kind of sociological question, you could say, but it's also an ethico-political and organizational one. I get the impression from this presentation and from reading some of your other recent work that you maintain a certain investment in the traditions of anarchism, of DIY, self-organization, of autonomous alternative culture, and so on. I think most of us here are sympathetic to that. NATO, the overall programming of this is certainly sympathetic. Here's the question, though. How might people invested in that type of practice, that type of ethos, counter-institutions, para-institutions, all these other things, how might we relate not just to, say, a model like indie media, which is famous from the Seattle moment and has continued to do important work, but also the fact that in the United States now, there actually has developed a fairly robust, let's say, mainstream progressive culture that's very much bound up with the multimedia platforms that encompasses everything from The Nation magazine to Mother Jones to Facebook, and also, importantly, MSNBC. And I think it's important not to underestimate the importance of that as a site for the formation of new types of political subjectivities. Rachel Maddow, for instance, is an ex-ACT UP activist, and her program often remediates things like yes men interventions, or glitter bombing Newt Gingrich, or longer-term kind of advocacy work around films like Gasland, dealing with fracking, or The Last Mountain, about the Appalachian mountaintop removal. So I wonder if, actually, when I saw that image of the figure of this enigma of the professional, right, and the non-replaceable professional, I'm almost wondering if this new kind of spectrum or landscape of progressive media culture that also encompasses anarchist, self-organized type of experiments as well, I wonder if there's actually a role for art criticism in its specificity to actually take on a new kind of a function that would do the articulatory mediating that you call for in the Eventwork model. Because I don't know if you know, I mean, how many really popular contemporary left-wing art critics can you think of, right? Not that many. Like Barry Schwabsky for The Nation, no. Right? Holland Cotter, like, definitely props to him, but he's got like a lot of work to do at the New York Times, right? So the question is, you know, what would it mean? And I think of someone like you who's dealt with, you know, and addressed many different kinds of constituencies, different platforms, different geographies, and so on. Maybe you want to hold on to your identity as a professional art critic and not dissolve everything into kind of extradisciplinary research, even though that's obviously, you know, that's always going to be a facet of your work. But what about this thing of the art critic? Is that relevant, do you think?
Well, you know, I don't think, I mean, I wrote a text once where the end, you know, this text basically, it's called Liar's Poker, and the thesis is basically simple about the relation to institutions. The thesis is take the money and run, right? I mean, that's the idea. And at the end I say that you really know the person by that moment when they leave and they dissolve into a social movement. So your word dissolve, I mean, it has some resonance for me. But I think that's a moment, because I think there's some kind of a, you know, we can't be simple people. It would be hard for me to forget, you know, living in Paris for 20 years. Really hard. I mean, you know, multitudes, all that, philosophy. You don't forget these things. No one does, I don't think. I think society has made more and more of that. What, in fact, I think those things are what encourages, and notably philosophy, are what encourage a kind of consciousness that we're not going far enough. You see, we have a left, robust media, a robust left media. Wow. I mean, this is optimism. This is radiant optimism, as Brett Bloom would say.
Well,
and I love to hear it.
Compared to 5 years ago.
Compared to 5 years ago.
Like,
so how to go to the point where what we get when a disaster happens, like the abrogation of collective bargaining rights, how to get to the point where what we get is not a referendum that we then lose. This is the question of Wisconsin, right? Because all the organizations, including MoveOn and all that, pushed people to the electoral channels, which are the same ones that into which you know, we invested to produce Obama. You know, some put it as 5-war president, right? You know, I mean, in other words, for the left to be robust, I would say the dissenting far extreme left has to be robust. Not extreme in the way of Tucumán Arde with their Guevarist idea, extreme in a way that doesn't accept that the possibility of an amelioration is enough. And I think that is something, I mean, it makes me a bit passionate. Because, you know,
affectively
when I
engaged.
compare it to, I used to live in Europe, you know, people are on the fucking streets there right now in the face of the austerity things. And I mean, we had this in Wisconsin for a moment, and we got what you know, this kind of compromise formation of the pseudo-social democratic system produces, which is, you know, this bid for a referendum, a recall, et cetera, which doesn't work, you know? So what you need to do, and what people are pushing to do in Europe very actively, is go one step further and say, look, there is a real problem, not a fake problem. This real problem won't be solved by another loan, because the problem was created by the previous loan. And that, I think, is where, if Rachel Maddow can take us there, of course I want to work, maybe not everything has to be MSNBC.
Oh, no, certainly not.
But
Definitely not
if it's possible to work with that, of course, no, I don't want to work with it, but I want it to happen.
Right on.
They might well. They might.
We're
well work
gonna.
with it.
Hey, well, listen. We're gonna take some questions from y'all, but I want to just give it up for these guys real quick. Thanks so much. Just I get the microphone first, so I can ask my question first. So I work in an institution. I'm professionalized, right? I'm wearing this jacket. So what would you like to see, just kind of brass tacks terms? Maybe let's just play Brian's going to reinvent an institution. Not some sort of utopian, like you're going to come up with some idea that isn't going to happen. But like, some brass tacks terms of what you'd like to see happen or ways that could actually, let's say there's people here, directors here, they're like, I'm with you, Brian. I'm going to do that. What can I do? So what can they do?
Well, I mean, we were just talking about this in the green room.
Yeah, it's a good professional
and that
ritual.
my idea, I mean, is I think that the big thing that's changed in the world is that communication is cheap, and we can use it to send tragic love letters to each other while the planet basically goes down, or we can do something else with it. To do something else with it, we'd have to make a transformation of institutions that allows for the autonomy of people whose education, whose expanded mind and whose expanded sensorium doesn't just become from the rising in the ranks of a certain symbolic structure watched over by people whose basic instinctual drive is to preserve that structure. So if you really take on this sort of multiple networked condition, first of all, by using the technology, but by using the technology in experimental ways, by using the different relationship to audiences in experimental ways, by opening up the kind of box that I just opened up, or saying that you can legitimately look at art beyond art alongside other practices, which you can do. And in fact, that's the place where you can do it. We've been doing it in Europe for years, Documenta 10, I collaborated on it. That's why I put a slide up on there of that. The No Border movement was launched there. Not invented, but launched there, launched right out of that thing. Out of what? Out of the hybrid media workspace in the Documenta 10, And then afterwards, the next 5 minutes in that became the communications hub for this whole, a surge of global activism and this chance for generations that hadn't had an experience of being full political people to have that experience. So I think this can be done, and not only that, because that's where experimentation is happening, you can legitimate it with intelligence and passion. So there's actually and then when you get fired, you can just start it again because you have credit elsewhere, I mean, this is my thing. I mean, okay, it's optimistic and whatever. So, but yes, I think it's not that easy, but it becomes, how do you say it? Once you have the taste, it's really hard to give it up, I think.
The taste. I love that. I got the taste. So, right on. You.
I have a few. Okay, my notes are a little bit all over the place, but I guess what I was thinking is, one of the things I was thinking about is, okay, the aesthetics of the image, politics is aesthetics, and the examples that you brought up are really potent. They're really, I didn't know about Argentina. I mean, I know about the neoliberalization of Argentina, the experiment of putting in the dictators, and in Chile also, and it's interesting to see those results, but I'm kind of surprised he didn't come up with examples that were happening in the United States around the same time of very potent political image, such as Muhammad Ali refusing to be drafted. He's a black man who pretty much being allowed to be in one of the only few professions of a black man being like a sports figure that can be watched by the white hegemonic society, and he refused to be drafted because why would he support the Vietnam War? Why would he fight his brown brothers and sisters if people are getting like hosed and have dogs sent upon them and lynched in the United States? So I don't know. I feel like you could have brought up some examples that were happening around the same time in the 60s as well here, that were their own kind of like though black people were brought over, it's almost kind of like its own kind of like, just like in Argentina, it's like the Latinos against the quote unquote indigenous people or Mayans. It's, you know, it's kind of the same thing going on here. And that also kind of made me think about what makes something sexy? What makes something sexy? What makes something sexy to talk about? And I'm just so surprised that everybody is going on and on about like, oh man, it's so cool. Everybody's camping out Puerto del Sol in Spain. This is like fucking awesome. And you know, do you hear about the protests? Or like there's that dog in Greece that's always like in all the protests. And it's like people were like camping out in front of City Hall, you know, until 2 nights ago, because the budget cuts are going to be fucking crazy. I mean, and there was like maybe like a dozen people or half a dozen people at some time. I never heard anybody talking about it. Okay, I have other things to say, but I guess what I want to ask, what makes something sexy? What makes something snowball? Wisconsin snowballed. Wisconsin became this huge thing. Why, for example, in New York, austerity measures like more budget cuts, libraries, teachers, preschools, everything being cut. Why was no one responding to that in our own city?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of questions. I mean, you know, what makes something snowball, I think, is the one that maybe doesn't pertain in a way, because things snowball in the media without producing anything. You know, so you said it. I mean, exactly it. You know, people are saying it's fantastic, Tahrir Square, Puerta del Sol, the rotunda of Wisconsin, but there's 10 people camping in front of the city hall here and nobody cares, you know? So the question of the snowball is a funny one, because there are some snowballs that just melt. There are other ones that roll and roll, you know? What I was trying to get at, and the reason, you know, in Argentina in 1968, everyone was looking at what was really conceived here as the Black Revolution, conceived by people here, you know, I mean, everyone was looking at it. There's that incredible, you know, Cuban poster made by the OSPAL, you know, where they said, we destroy imperialism from the outside, they destroy imperialism from the inside, right? I mean, so why did I talk about that? Well, because what I wanted to do, because of where we are, was talk about how do people in a situation, a symbolic situation like art, what do they do to get beyond the limits of that situation? That's why I talked about that. And I think when you look into history, you find many different ways in different walks of life, chances that people have to go beyond the limits chances that they do or do not take, you know? And what I'm really wondering is, I think the same thing you're wondering, how to find a way to take that chance now? Because it really means taking a chance and a risk, you know? At the same time as we're faced by risks, large risks, we're also faced by the idea that we would have to risk something to, you know, even just risk getting a cold, right? Camping out in front of the, you know, and getting thrown in jail and getting beaten by the police and so on and so on. Where does that come from? What I was trying to get at in the talk was not a universal theory of where that comes from, but a very kind of precise theory of where that can come from in certain cases, in certain milieus, you know. Well, now I don't have I think my answer to you is why that didn't happen here is because if it would take this room to make that happen here, but this room would have to really want to and would have to really try. That's my idea. And so I think that's why it didn't happen here. Well, let's figure out how to start trying.
So I got another question out there. Here.
Thanks for all of that, Brian. I'll keep the question really short. I just want you, if you can, to name a few different art groups and individuals who are making the kinds of changes that you're promoting.
What I've come to be really the most interested in recently are the people that I can actually collaborate with, you know? So I decided to move back to Chicago because Chicago has this sort of do-it-yourself deal because we're not in the spotlight. There is no snowball, just piles of the stuff, you know? There's nothing going on unless you're the one going on to make it happen. So, that becomes a neighborhood thing, I mean, the superstars on the horizon are the people who come to mess hall, I mean, they're the people who spend the night in our house because we basically, people who need a place to stay, stay with us. What we've done here with 16 Beaver, I mean, for me is the must, I mean, this is, so the people that I worked with during the big wave of activism around the turn of the century, are numerous. I mean, I could also, among the things I could also have shown is what's happening in Argentina today, Okay, I mean, check out Iconoclasistas if you want to see what really grew out of the Argentinian, rebellion. Check out Marcelo Exposito's work if you want to see how somebody has maintained an artist, activist, critic, journalist practice for the last 15 years. That's pretty interesting. I mean, these are the names that are in my work, because what else would I write about except, and now I don't know that these are the superstars of anyone else but, my astrology, because it's a question of passion. Who can you get to know in the world, So it seems to me now, are there people that I don't know who I think are great? Undoubtedly. I personally, somebody said that Mel Chin is terrible. I don't know him at all. But his work seemed great. I mean,
He's
to
the
me.
best.
I mean, so seem to be, let's see, but I would be embarrassed if I started to produce more and more spontaneous adulation, so I'll just cut.
Actually, speaking of embarrassing, I don't mean to out you here about this, Brian, but Brian actually produced recently a really lovely catalog essay for Trevor Paglin, who I think in many ways exemplifies the kind of expanded research type of project that we've been talking about, but who's also very invested in questions of form and questions of art history. And Brian's essay reflected that, some lovely thoughts about Turner and Stieglitz and other art historical figures like that.
This is the answer to your question, I mean, that interests me because it's damn interesting. Trevor's the only person I know who can expand my mind into the direction and my technical capacity into the direction of how do you track a satellite. And it's not just any satellite. It's a secret satellite, a military satellite. Why do I want to know that? Because I feel like not knowing it is exactly what I would call the unconscious. And I think it's not just a technical thing. It's a thing that's, it's kind of a deep thing, the unconscious, because it's what tells you to do when you don't know, right? And the non-knowledge surrounding what the military does is, I think ultimately can only be opened up by an actual confrontation with that thing we call the U.S. military. We are so far from that we have to start by looking through a telescope, and that's what Trevor does. And the telescope is connected to not just a camera, but a camera that's connected to the history of photography and to art history. And I think that's a really interesting, one of those interesting machines that's out there. And so this is the kind of thing that it's one of the things that I get interested, but you can get interested in stuff at different levels. It can go from, the temporary services in mess hall is, kind of, or what we're doing with the Midwest Radical Cultural Corridor, my bet is that you can combine very technical things, very difficult, even arduous sorts of investigations with much looser, much more open and sort of flowing and everyday ones.
We got time for one more. One more? I know there's one more.
One more.
What? Oh, shut up. You're in.
Hi, I found it very interesting that you were talking about the power structures that prevent very free movement and possibilities of people just doing what they want. How much role do you think in the art world do the big institutions play, and then on top of that, the critics who like to put labels on things and say, okay, this does not fit into this label, so therefore it is not, art or activism or something. And I feel like people are always questioning the artists and saying they're not doing enough. And, do the critics have something to say about that?
Well, I actually don't know the institutional art world here in the United States very well at all, because by the time I left Europe, I was so sick of the institutional art world, where I began, working as a translator, and then ultimately, as I had sort of attained to it, I became sick of it and I left, right? So I don't really know. I mean, I know the university world much better. But what fascinates me in Europe, fascinates is a weird word, is that these white cubes, people go into them thinking that it's a public sphere. It's generally funded in a majority by a bank, by finance capital. It is, if you have any sort of progressive, idealistic, ecological, left-wing sort of, this place is really your enemy. And what you create there, as Leon Ferrari said, is your enemy. So why do people do it? This is, and why they do it clearly has to do with the symbolic. There's clearly, this is the only thing where if Zizek was able to speak and write coherently as he does not, this would be the one point where I would be really interested in what he has to say. Because there's something going on there. And it's not just with the TV or whatever, it's with the bloody art world. And it's with those white cubes. And it's with those critics, and it's with a glass of champagne behind which is a jet plane connected to a Swiss bank account, That's what's going on. I mean, but you could work on that, but it's also very boring to work on that. It's very boring to work on that, except that it has power, because it has the power to channel people's not just imagination, but their desire, their sexuality, their inventiveness, their intellect, and above all, their time. It channels your time, So, I mean, I have some strategies. I'm a very bad communicator. I don't participate in Skype meetings. There's all kinds of things that I don't do because I don't want to have my time channeled in a certain way, because I've had enough experience with that. And I want to create something before I'm dead. And if I would keep on letting that type of institution set the rules, I would create nothing. So, and it's an answer, I think.
It's definitely an answer, and effective, too. Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks so much, Yates. And thanks to you for coming out.